Hi, welcome to Aging for Life. I'm Teresa Reed, your host. As the world population ages, people are increasingly worried about dementia. Individuals are worried that they or a loved one will develop dementia, and social policy experts are worried about ballooning costs of more people living with dementia. My guest tonight is Dr. Kenneth Langa, professor of internal medicine, gerontology, and health management and policy at the University of Michigan. Dr. Langa's research focuses on the incidence, causes, and costs of dementias. In an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2017, Dr. Langa and colleagues reported on a study showing a large decline in dementia rates across a broad population in America, from 11.6% in 2000 to 8.8% in 2012. This is great news, but complicated news. Dr. Langa is here to talk with me about types of dementia, factors that influence who gets dementia and who doesn't, and a range of interventions to continue to decrease its incidence or severity. Dr. Langa, welcome.
Thanks, Teresa.
So glad you're here.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with understanding types of dementia.
All right. First of all, it's good to try to understand the difference between the terms Alzheimer's disease and dementia,
Right.
Which are often confused. And it's the way to think about it is that dementia is a general term that means decline in memory, decline in thinking, that gets severe enough that someone's no longer able to take care of themselves. So that's what dementia is. It's, the medical term is a syndrome. It's a sort of collection of symptoms and problems. There are a number of different things that cause dementia, and Alzheimer's disease is the one that's sort of probably most well known, and we think perhaps most commonly the cause. About sometimes people put it in the 60 to 70% range of dementia being caused by Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
But there are multiple other things like small strokes or vascular disease, vascular dementia. There's something called frontotemporal dementia, Lewy bodies. So there's a bunch of different pathologies in the brain, problems in the brain that can lead to this cognitive decline and disability of dementia. And then the complexity you mentioned in your introduction is what we've learned over the last 20 years or so is that most people that get dementia have multiple pathologies in their brain. It's not just the Alzheimer's disease or just the vascular problems. And these problems overlap and interact in complicated ways. So I think one of the take-homes from this research is that sort of fixing one problem, like the protein of Alzheimer's disease, the bad protein of Alzheimer's disease, may not be enough to stop the cognitive decline or stop the dementia from happening.
And on the reverse of that, you can have a lot of, some patients have a lot of protein deposits that are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, but end up without symptoms because they don't have other complicating factors that spark that, right? Spark the symptoms.
That's right, yep.
Okay.
And I think there's this general concept that's helpful to think about, which we think of as brain fitness or brain health, or some people would call it cognitive reserve, the idea that the brain cells themselves are healthy, the connections between the brain cells are healthy, and that reserve, in some ways like a physical fitness or muscle strength, that reserve allows some people to get the proteins, get the pathologies in their brain, but still continue thinking normally. So that's an important balance, the sort of cognitive reserve and the fitness that one has compared to the amount of pathologies that are building up in the brain.
Okay, I want cognitive reserves. How do I get them?
Good question. So I should say that as we were talking about before, this is complicated. I think it's good to be humble when we're talking about the brain and how the brain works, because there's still lots that we don't know. But I think there's a general sense that there's a few things you can do to sort of build this reserve. One is education seems to be an important way to build up or strengthen your brain in some ways, that it seems as though those who go to school longer and what exactly it is about the school, we're not sure, but people who go to school longer seem to have more of this reserve, able to be more resilient when they're getting these pathologies. So formal schooling seems to be one important way to build reserve. Other things that people can do are to stay sort of cognitively active throughout life. So thinking about complicated things, sort of what you do with your brain during your job and occupation, keeping it active, staying socially connected, thinking or talking and thinking about complex things. Those are the ways we think that you can kind of keep those brain connections healthy and keep that reserve.
Yeah, I felt happy reading about that in your chapter that you sent me, because I was concerned about years of formal education, because as we know in our culture, that is not very equally distributed.
Right.
Communities of color and many urban communities and many rural communities, I mean, access to solid early education that takes you on into more years of formal education is not well distributed. And so I want to return to that, but I do want to just point to the fact that you had mentioned in the article that you don't, even if you miss out on the early formal education, if you're cognitively very active, in the years following education, that is also, you can also build cognitive reserves in that way.
I think that's right. Yeah, one of the, I think, optimistic conclusions or general ideas from the work that we and others have been doing that have been studying this is that, things aren't set in stone early in life.
Right.
With how much education you've got, that sort of brain health and really health in general is more kind of a life course perspective is important to take. So even if you haven't exercised earlier in life, we haven't talked about exercise, another way to keep your brain healthy, but staying mentally, cognitively active later in life, that seems to be important. There's some controversy about this, but it does seem as though your brain develops new brain cells. You actually get new brain cells developing later.
Neuroplasticity.
That's right, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. Again, it's a complicated topic.
Even late in life, though, right?
Even late in life.
Yeah.
So I think many people, my take on this is that, if you stay cognitively active, thinking, reading, talking with friends, again, that's in some ways like education in that you're keeping the brain cells active and sort of keeping that reserve intact.
Yeah, right. Keeping the blood flowing, which is something you mentioned. You just mentioned about physical exercise.
Right.
Feeding your brain. So that's really important, because when I read about that, I guess I was a little surprised, because I didn't think about, like, I know I'm doing cardiovascular work and it's helping my heart, but I didn't really think about feeding my brain cells.
Again, I think in terms of brain health, there's, again, three general things to think about. We talked about the reserve, sort of the fitness of the brain, but then also the blood flow, and then inflammation, kind of those three interacting factors. And the blood flow is extremely important. Again, we've learned a lot more about that. Evolution's given us a good hint that blood flow is important to the brain. Your brain's only about 3% of your body weight, but it gets 20% of the blood flow. So brain cells need a constant good flow of blood to keep the brain cells healthy. So anything that's going to improve and your blood flow decrease blockages like atherosclerosis in the brain or in the blood vessels throughout your body, we think is important for keeping your brain healthy. So things like physical activity, keeping your blood pressure well controlled if you have high blood pressure, diabetes, good diet, all of those things that kind of keep blood vessels healthy seem to be important for decreasing the risk for dementia also, because of the importance of blood flow to the brain.
That's really great. So that makes me even more motivated to exercise.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I want to clarify one point. Your study was met with lots of excitement because, yay, the prevalence in the population dropped over that period of time, over, 14 years. Is that right?
We were looking in that study between 2000 and 2012, so about 12 years, but
Okay.
we've actually looked 10 years before that too,
Okay.
and so over about 20 years, and other studies have found a similar decline in risk over that time period.
Right, and one of the really important facets of your study was that it's a broad population. It's not just wealthy white people in some area. It's a broad swath of the population.
That's right. We use data from a big study that's done at the University of Michigan called the Health and Retirement Study, where we've been following about 20,000 people, as you mentioned, all races and ethnicities, a nationally representative sample. So we do have a large sample, geographically diverse, ethnically diverse. So we do think that that's an important part of the study, is that we've got not just a single geographic area or a single well-educated people, but a broad swath of the population.
Yeah, so that's huge, and so it's a 3% drop in prevalence, right?
Yeah, about
8.62
or
11,
two-ish or 2.5 percentage point drop during that time time period.
So
right.
a couple million people, or a million, and I don't know, in the millions of people who otherwise we would have expected to have dementia, maybe have died from dementia, did not. So that's great. And yet we're reading every day about how the wave of dementia that's approaching us as the population ages. So let's talk about that, because both of these things are true, even though intuitively it doesn't seem right. So. Right.
Yep. No, a great question, and again, another thing that's often confusing, and so I think it is a good idea to talk about. So again, what we were studying was the prevalence of dementia in the population. Prevalence is a rate, the number of people who have dementia over, say, all of the 65 plus people in the country. That seemed to decline. So one way to think about that is an 80-year-old person in, say, 2000 or even 1990 had a higher risk of having dementia than an 80-year-old person in 2012 or more recently. So kind of the jargon is the age-specific risk has declined. But the other trend that you mentioned, Teresa, is that there's a big increase in the number of older people in the United States and other countries around the world, aging of the baby boomers. So even though the risk per person is less, because there's so many more older people in the country and around the world, there's going to be more people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease, even if the risk has gone down some. So that's the sometimes confusing difference there. So it's definitely the case that, or almost certainly the case, that there'll be more people with dementia in the United States, even if the risk declines.
Right. Okay. And another thing to just make life a little more complicated, I wanted that researchers who are counting cases of dementia based on coroner's reports, right, are going to be affected by an artifact that's developing now as coroners more frequently report dementia as cause of death, right? I mean, they might have reported it as cardiovascular disease, and now they're recognizing, wait, actually it's dementia that's a cause of death. So that's another complicating factor in the picture.
Absolutely, yeah, it is. That's right. That right. There's, as you've probably seen, lots of reports of the increasing number of people who die from dementia or Alzheimer's disease over the last 20 years. And it's probably the case that there has been some increase in the number of people that have died either with or due to dementia. But as you said, part of the increase or part of that growth in numbers is probably an artifact in that physicians or other people who are filling out death certificates are now more likely to say that someone has died with dementia even with the same amount of cognitive impairment than 20 years ago, just because there's been more recognition of the condition. And so that's that is, again, another of the complexities of trying to get a bead on exactly
where we are.
Where we are with the number of people.
Right, okay. So, but we can anticipate millions of cases of dementia, a great increase in the number of cases of dementia in the coming decades.
Probably so. Again, our estimates are that about 4 to 5 million people in the United States have dementia now. And I think, again, lots of estimates. Part of the uncertainty is, will this decline in risk that we found in our study continue into the future?
Right.
Will it kind of level off, or will it even perhaps increase in the future? So that's, again, a moving target that makes predicting how many cases we'll have more difficult. But again, the number of people 65 and older in the United States is about 50 million now. It's going to go up to over 85 million or so in the next 25 or 30 years. So almost certainly there'll be an increase in the number of cases of dementia, just because, again, the dementia is so tied to older age that likely maybe a doubling of cases from 4 million up to 8 million or so over the next 30 years are what some of the estimates would be.
Okay, and a disproportionate number of those will be African Americans and Hispanics, is that right? People of color, people who have not had access to great education and are perhaps not in as solid cardiovascular health.
I think that's right. Yeah, again, I think that's one of the unfortunate pieces of or conclusions that we've drawn from our research and other people doing this kind of research, is that it does appear that African Americans and Hispanics have a higher risk for dementia. Again, I think some of the reasons you mentioned are important factors. The lower levels of education, perhaps even among people who do get education, the education may be of lower quality. For instance, in the South during the 40s and 50s. And then there are the issues of less good cardiovascular health among many minority populations, more smoking, more high blood pressure that's not controlled, all of these things that we think increase one's risk for heart problems, but also brain problems. There's also interesting aspects of this that aren't totally understood yet. Again, there was an interesting study that found that African Americans who were born in the stroke belt, what's known as the southern, sort of southeastern part of the United States, where there's higher incidence of stroke. So people who live there are at higher risk of dementia. That might not be as surprising given this connection with cardiovascular disease. But even people who move to other parts of the country from the stroke belt still seem to be at higher risk for dementia. I read that.
So how do you account for that?
I think it's unclear. I think some of the thoughts are that what kind of takes hold in some sense in early life, diet, exercise, obesity, or things like that might have their starts in early life, or sort of follow people in some ways to other parts of the country that aren't within the stroke belt. That could be one thing that's going on. We haven't talked yet about potential environmental factors, environmental toxins that might also be playing a role. That could be part of the story. Again, as you mentioned, this theme of complexity. There are so many things going on that could be increasing risk in the environment, or again,
what kinds of environmental toxins? Yeah.
Yep. So lots of interest and research now in looking at things like air pollution. That seems to be an important aspect to the brain, that both in terms of kind of a direct effect on the brain. Some of the particles from airborne pollution can get right into the brain through the nasal passages and the nerves going back there. But also, again, another pathway perhaps through the cardiovascular system. Again, we know that air pollution seems to have a negative effect on blood vessels, on blood flow, and that might be part of it. There's also, the other obvious and important issue is lead in people's drinking water. Getting high levels of lead in your body as a kid, like has happened in Flint here in Michigan, we know about, seems to have very negative effect on brain health that can last into later life. So those are some of the toxins or environmental risks that people might come in contact with, more or less, depending on where they are geographically.
So dementia is a social justice issue?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to think about it that way. I certainly think about it that way, that one's brain health and maybe cardiovascular health more generally does seem to be very differs across socioeconomic statuses. It seems as though, again, over the last 20 years, there's been increasing disparities in life expectancy, cardiovascular health, brain health, probably for, again, some of these reasons that we've talked about and other reasons that we're not sure of yet.
With wealthier people gaining many years of life over the last couple decades. Right? And African American and other populations losing.
That's right. Yeah, the people in the top 20% or so of wealth distribution over the last 40 years or so, there's been an increase in life expectancy of 4 or 5 years among that group, whereas there's been actually a decline in life expectancy in some in low income groups. So so that life expectancy difference has been widening over time.
So so dementias are a social justice and environmental issue, and to address, if we're worried about dementias into the future, we should fund early childhood education universally, right? And clean up the environment.
Yeah, no, I definitely think, and sometimes I think some of my colleagues at the medical school think this is thinking too expansively, but I do think that education policy is in some ways very much a health policy. That
well, of course it is.
Yeah, that there seems to be such a close link to both early preschool and even before preschool, sort of what's happening in people's homes and kind of the interaction, the intellectual interactions or reading or things like that, then on into secondary education, et cetera. It does seem like there's a close link to health. Again, the pathways and the reasons that education leads to health are complicated, but it does seem as though it's an important piece of the puzzle in terms of staying healthy is to get education, feel as though you're in control of your life in some ways, can do some of the things that you want to do. All of those things seem to have an important effect on health.
Okay. We haven't even talked about genetics, and we're just about out of time. But I know there are genetic factors in some dementias, correct?
That's right. No, it's definitely the case that there are genes that seem to increase the risk for dementia. There's a number of genes that are rare that cause early onset dementia. So, and this is just again a small segment of people with dementia, but people start having cognitive problems in their 40s or 50s, and that's due to a rare genetic mutation that makes the Alzheimer's protein build up in the brains earlier in life. Wow. But the more general or the more common forms of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, there's also some genes. There's one called the apolipoprotein E gene, that having a certain form of that increases one's risk for dementia. Again, the pathways are still not entirely clear. That protein that's coded by that gene carries lipids, fats in the blood. So again, there's that clear connection between the cardiovascular system and the brain. So yeah, again, part of the puzzle is genetic. If you have those genes, you have increased risk. But again, I think, and actually working on a study with some colleagues now, that suggests that even with the higher genetic risk, doing some of these behavioral things that we talked about, staying physically active, keeping your blood pressure controlled, keeping your brain active, can really, in some ways, offset that higher genetic risk. So I do, and when I talk with my patients, I think thinking about all of these factors, the genes, the behavioral, physical activity, controlling your blood pressure, what you're trying to do is to decrease your risk as much as possible. There's no guarantees. Again, you can do everything right and still get dementia for whether it's bad luck or just other things going on, or again, the genes. But I think overall there's good evidence that doing these things we talked about can decrease your risk in the long run.
And universal early childhood education and cleaning up the environment.
Absolutely. No, I do think,
I like that you think expansively. I think that's
it's
exactly right.
Yeah, no, I think it's clear that, again, the things that affect your brain are what's around us and what we're doing with our brains. So I'm pretty convinced that better education, more widespread access to education would do good things for dementia risk in our population.
Great. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Teresa.
For being here.
Thank you.